Tonight, I'd like to take a little bit of time and relate a little bit about my father. And I'll explain why afterwards. But my father was a really good person, in my view. He had a lot of really, really good qualities. And yet he'd had kind of a rough, younger life. I think he'd spent some time with people that weren't the kind of people that he became. So he must have overcome some difficulties and some habits and some characteristics that existed, at least with people that he was around. Some of them were his own family members, but he was able to overcome them. And I'm sure that he had some of his own difficulties to overcome. I don't know a lot about those days in his life. He never talked much about them, and neither did my mother. But I could tell that my mother was proud of him. When she spoke of him right up to the time, right up to his funeral, her comments were always positive, and she expressed gratitude for his life and the kind of person that he was. And growing up, we got some insight into this life, into this kind of person that he was and the life that he had before he got married. A little bit anyway, because of a story that I'm going to relate to you. And the story is about a horse. And the horse's name was just Old Whitey. Old Whitey. I never saw the horse. I never knew what the horse was really like other than through stories that my dad had told. But he told them with a lot of conviction and a lot of fondness. And my older siblings and my mother and those that were around to experience it all verified the stories. And it was quite interesting. So the story went something like this. Before my dad got married, he ended up working at a ranch. He did a lot of just day work for farmers and ranchers in the area, and he worked for a man out in the area of Geneva, Idaho, which is I don't know, maybe 20 miles east of Montpelier. If any of you have been through that area, you know the town. It's not really much of a town. It's kind of a few houses on a fork in the road. And anyway, he spent some time out there working for a man. And if I remember the name, I think it was James Toomer, runs in my mind. My older siblings could maybe verify for sure, but this man by the name of Toomer had some land, some acreage, and needed help, and my dad was willing to help, and he worked with others on this ranch. Well, it just so happened that on this ranch, and the ranch extended not just into the, had some meadowland and some haying ground and range land, and it went clear up into the hills it was actually west of the ranch, but ended up being clear up kind of east of Bear Lake, clear up in the hills and a little bit to the north. And then that's where you find Pegram if you're coming in from the hilltop on the Bear Lake side. And that's where his ranch was. Well, my dad worked on that ranch and had struck a deal with the landowner, Mr. Toomer, and the deal was this, that he would be willing to work and not receive money for a segment of his pay if Mr. Toomer would help him catch a horse that was up in the hills, a wild Mustang that had a band of horses up there, and they were just wild in every sense of the word. They'd never been tamed, I don't think, most of them, and if some of them had been, they'd broken loose. And anyway, they were wild. And there was a stallion that was over this herd of Mustangs, and he was a white horse. Therefore, we get the name Old Whitey. And my dad, I'm not sure he called him Old Whitey before he actually caught him or not, but he was able to talk this Mr. Toomer into getting some hands and actually catching him. And I've heard a little bit about how that was done, but I'm not sure the story's all accurate. They got some hands and chased him down into a narrow area, and I think eventually into a kind of a holding facility of some sort, and where they were able to get a rope around his neck and control him, and he was just wild. He was a vicious horse, and everybody that talked to my dad said, "Why would you want a horse like that? I mean, what can you do with a horse that's that wild and crazy and never been tamed and doesn't want to be tamed?" And my dad just, for some reason, wanted the horse. Well, anyway, he got the horse, and when the summer work was done, that fall, I guess, took the horse home, and I can remember my dad telling a little bit about how he was able to break the horse. He had some help, I think, to originally get on it, and of course it bucked and carried on, and I suppose he got throwed a few times before he finally was able to get on the horse and actually stay on it. But he didn't give up. He just kept at it. There was something in him that just drove him to tame that horse. And I think part of it was that he didn't have any real transportation back in those days except for a horse. And if he didn't have a horse, he couldn't get around. And so he thought this particular horse would be the one that he wanted. And it wasn't going to cost him as much as if he bought one that was already broke and somebody else had trained. And anyway, he saw it as his way to have transportation. And I think there was a little, what would we say, maybe a little pride quest in there somewhere. He wanted to have that particular horse. And the story that I remember the most, there are several of them, but the one that stands out in my mind is when my father was training the horse, and the horse let him stay on for a little while. And then as soon as he got him out on the roadway, and when I say roadway, we're not talking a highway, it's just a dirt road, but it was out there where in the area where I grew up as a boy, and he got him on that roadway, and the horse started to gallop, and Dad didn't have any way to control him. He was not going to stop. He'd pull on the reins, and he'd just throw his head down and keep on running, and he'd picking up speed, and nothing's, everything that Dad was trying to do wasn't stopping him. And anyway, I have to tell the story the way I heard it. He just kind of hung on for dear life, hoping that he wouldn't get thrown off, because that horse went on a runaway, and took off and turned a corner on the road and just kept going south on that, what we call the Lanark Road, just as hard as he could go. Well, my dad hung on, and after about a mile and a half, or close to, anyway, a mile and a half, mile and 3/4, something like that, from what I can gather. There was a point at which old Whitey started to run out of wind. He was he started running, and he ran just as hard and fast as he could, thinking that he could shake my dad off, I guess, with the speed and get his own way and run free again. Maybe get back up into the hills, because he was kind of running in that direction. But my dad sensed that he was starting to slow down a little bit, and that's when my dad's strategy kicked in, and he decided, no. He said, "You're not slowing down at all. It was your idea to do this running thing, and now that you've done it, you're going to keep doing it." And so now, when the horse was thinking about slowing down, my dad was thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to win this after all." And he started kicking the horse in the ribs and making it go faster and faster and faster at the same time that it was trying to slow down. And there was a fork in the road to the left where they kind of turned back toward a full circle to where they started from, but it was miles away yet. And he was able to pull the horse's head around and get him to turn that way. And all the time he was kicking that horse in the ribs, saying, "Come on, speed up, speed up." And now the tables were changed. The horse wanted to slow down more than ever, because it would just give out. And it had run for a long ways. And I can remember my dad telling the story how he just made that horse keep running and running and running and running. And every time he'd let up a little bit, the horse would want to slow down and maybe even stop. And my dad said I wouldn't stand for it. And I was going to show him who was boss. And so he just kept kicking him and kicking him. Finally, he got down closer to the Ovid area, and he turned his head another way, and they started back up on a stretch. They had about a mile or more to go to get back to where they started, and he just kept kicking him, and the horse was, at this point, was just totally exhausted. And eventually, they got back close to where the starting point was, and Dad let up on the kicking. And I can't remember for sure how or whether he got off the horse, or I don't believe he did. I think he just slowed the horse down and held the reins tight and started him back into a more normal walk. But the horse's sides, he said, were just heaving for air because he was so give out. But it was that event, according to my dad's story. He said, "I never had any trouble with that horse after that. Up till that time, it was a problem. Every single time he got on it, there was problems of one sort or another, because he was mean. He'd try to bite, he'd try to kick, he'd try to scratch you off on the fence. He'd try to buck you off and get you down some way, and it was just a mean old stallion." My dad told stories about my uncle that lived just a quarter of a mile down the road that came over one day and wanted to see if he could ride him. Now, since my dad was doing just fine on him now, after that event, he smoothed right out and was able to do some things on him and get him to train and react the way he wanted him to. And my uncle wanted to give it a try. And my dad told about the experience. I guess my uncle crawled over the fence and had the bridle in hand and was going to put it on the horse. And anyway, that horse turned on him and lowered his head and just bared his teeth and came right after him. And my uncle ran just as hard as he could. And as he got closer to the fence that he climbed over, he kind of stumbled, and danged if that horse didn't turn around and try to kick him with his hind feet, because that's how stallions fought. They'd bite, and where the other horses, they'd bite and they'd back up to him and kick him and all kinds of things. And that's the way old Whitey was. He was just intent on fighting. Well, my dad used that horse. I don't know how old the horse would have been when he caught him. He would have had to have been several years old, because he was the herd champion. He was able to control a group of horses up there for his own. And so he wouldn't have been young when he was caught, but he must not have been too old, because Dad used him for a long time after that, and enjoyed lots of experiences on him, even though he was the only one that the horse would let Dad ride him, but nobody else could ride him. And it was all because, for some reason, Dad understood what it took to, should we say, break the horse's spirit, to the point that when he saw Dad coming, he knew who was in charge, and he'd accept him as the one in charge, but nobody else. And I think eventually they if you've been around animals very long, you spend a lot of time on them, whether it's a dog or any kind of animal, eventually you develop a bond. And it became pretty obvious, listening to my dad tell the story, that he had a bond with that horse. My dad was the watermaster of a canal company that started. The canal actually they let the water in the canal about 14 miles upstream, or upstream, I say up the canal, from the bottom end of it to the top was about 14 miles. My dad had to take care of the water, letting out water to the farmers in their ditches, and measuring it out so that they got the right amount and didn't get too much, and had to keep an eye on it. And he didn't make very much doing that, but he did it on old Whitey. Old Whitey was his transportation, and he could go up through the fields and check on the canal. Sometimes there'd be beaver dams in it, or some other washouts or problems, and he'd have to keep tabs on all that. And he did all that on his horse. I can still remember my mother talking about him coming to see her when he was on that horse. I guess he'd ride 4 or 5 miles up, 3 or 4 miles at least, up to her house, and he'd visit with her, and I don't know what they did or whatever, but he paid her visits, and sometimes he'd leave just at dusk or dark, and she'd tell about how she'd stand on the porch and she'd hear the horse hooves going for, I don't know, quite what seemed like forever, because he would get on old Whitey and they'd just gallop off for home, and she could hear those horse hooves off in the distance still going. So he must have ridden him wide open for a lot of years. But that horse was his transportation, and it ended up being his, in some ways, his livelihood. And he had just a lot of fond stories to tell about the horse, and how reliable the horse was, and how much they bonded with each other, I guess you'd say. So I was always kind of marveled at my dad when he told that story. I thought a little bit of him as being bigger than life, go up there and catch a wild Mustang and tame it, bring it home, continue to tame it and master it when nobody else could, and all those things just kind of made me think I got a pretty cool dad. And I still kind of think that, even though he's been gone for a long time. He he never had much given to him, but he knew how to work. And if he wanted something, whether it was my mother or that horse, or he ended up taking a chance on a piece of ground, 112 acres, and I think paid $5,000 for it. And the person that bought it, the ranch before then, or the farm before then, said, you'll never raise enough to pay for that. That was a stupid buy. But he went to work for another rancher out on what they call the Budge Ranch. And after he married my mother, they both went. They had their family started, and they were still working, and they paid that $5,000 debt off, I think they said in about 5 years, if I remember right. And people were thinking that it would take them a lifetime if they could do it at all, almost, because anyway, I think the loan from the bank was for much longer than that. But they didn't like debt, and they saw debt as a way of blocking their future and of somebody else controlling their dreams if they had debt. So they both worked. My mother worked in the kitchen on the ranch. My dad was a ranch hand. They worked with sheep, and he would bring lambs home from the ranch to our house when he continued working out there at certain times. And so we had a lot of what we call bum lambs. Those bum lambs were just lambs that were born to use, for example, that would have triplets. Sometimes they would have triplets, and they couldn't take care of all three, so we'd bring one home. We'd feed it off a bottle from the milk we got from cows and see what we could make of it. Usually the lambs didn't turn out as good as the ones that were with their mother, but we tried, and we did a little, and it helped out when we needed some meat, or we needed to sell one of them to get a little money or something. Well, we'd have some bum lambs, and it all came because he knew how to work, and if he wanted something, he found a way to get it. And the farm was the same way. It was just sagebrush and tumbleweeds and squirrel holes everywhere. I can remember catching squirrels under the fence lines. There were just hordes of them, and what crops we raised, they would come out from the fence lines from their holes, and they would just eat the crops before they ever had a chance to grow in lots of cases. So I spent a lot of time trapping. But he knew that if he just kept pecking away at things, eventually things would change. He knew that with the old Whitey horse. He knew it with his with choosing my mother for his wife. It's kind of an interesting story too, because I guess they passed each other on the sidewalk when they were 14, and they just walked past each other. And then for some reason, to hear him tell the story, for some reason they both decided to turn around and look at the other one. And so, you know how it is. You want to get another glance just to see if it was real or who that was or whatever. And they both turned around. They were looking right at each other because they both had the same thought at the same time. And my dad's always said, and my mother kind of confirmed it, that was the point at which he knew that was the girl he wanted to marry. But he was a long way from being ready and making it happen. But he kept working at it. My mother, I think more than my dad, kind of stated the motto that became their motto, their mantra, I guess you could say. A mantra is something that you repeat to yourself that keeps you moving forward. That mantra was, where there's a will, there is a way. Where there is a will, there is a way. I don't know how many times in my life when I was growing up, I'd have one of my parents say, usually my mother, but she would sit me down when something was not going right. one of the things that come to my mind is you'd have to dig post holes for fences, and sometimes the post holes would be pretty easy digging, but every now and then you'd hit into a gravel, rocky soil, and shovel usually worked. But when you hit into gravel and rock, the shovel stopped working, and the post hole still wasn't deep enough to hold the post. And some of those posts, especially if they were a gate post or something, or corner post, you had to sink those really deep and tamp them down and get extra big posts to go in there to do the job. So just because you hit a few rocks when you got down there about 8 inches didn't mean that you just quit. So, and you think of what they told you, you'd think, well, where there's a will, there's a way. And so you'd lay the shovel down and you'd go find a crowbar. Some of you may not even know what a crowbar is, but crowbar is basically just a long piece of iron with a point on the end of it, and it was quite heavy, and you'd get it, and it's kind of spear-shaped, and you'd ram that down in the hole until you hit rock, and then you'd ram it down again until you hit rock, and you'd just keep ramming it until you had blisters on your hands if you didn't have gloves. Of course, when we were fencing, we were trained to wear gloves. But just because you had a few rock didn't mean you quit. That just meant you tried a little harder and you made it work, because you couldn't change the fence line just because there was a rock. The post still had to go in, and it had to go in deep. So that's how you did it. It was with a crowbar. And sometimes I remember hitting right into like a flat rock, and you'd think, well, how can I get through that darn thing even with a crowbar? But in those instances, I found through the years, if you take that crowbar and you just keep pounding, and especially if you can kind of hit in the same place every time, pretty soon there gets to be a crack in that rock. And then that rock kind of opens up, and the crack gets a little bigger and a little bigger, and then you just keep ramming it in. Pretty soon it cracks a little more, and pretty soon you're through the rock, and you can just keep hitting it till the rock breaks up into littler pieces until you can finally reach in and get it out with either your hand if it's shallow enough, or with a shovel or something else. And if it didn't work, you got the crowbar after it again, and you just went to work till eventually you broke through that and got to where you could use the shovel again. And then you'd go down and you'd plant the post down deep like it was supposed to be planted, rather than just give up. Where there is a will, there is a way. I've said that to myself because it was said to me when I was growing up. And I think it was a mantra of my mom and my dad, even before, perhaps even before they got married. Well, yeah, I know before they got married, but earlier in their life. Maybe their parents had taught them. It was part of the pioneer spirit, I think, that was out there that I think we've lost in a lot of ways now. We have a tendency now that if things get tough, and they just stay tough, well, you quit and move on to something else. But the mindset then was, if it gets tough, you just try harder, or you use something more creative and you figure out how to get the job done. And then once you figured it out, you do it. And you can use what knowledge you gain in making things work the next time you had to do something. But it was a mantra. And it's a mantra that I would recommend to everyone. Where there is a will, there is a way. I put that to use when I was getting married, even. Because there's a lot of people that said, you can't do it. You're too young. you're bound to fail. And yet both my mother and my dad would talk to me individually and kind of get a feel for what my thoughts were, what my resolve was. And then they would repeat to me again, where there is a will, there is a way. And I might say that they were part of the way. My mother pawned her own wedding ring to help buy the wedding ring that I would give to my wife when we were engaged. So yeah, where there's a will, there's a way. There's a sacrifice that comes. You have to wear a few blisters on your hands getting through the post hole, the hard part of the post hole digging, and you have to give up some things that maybe you really wanted to make things happen, whether it's paying for a $5,000 ranch or giving up your own wedding ring to help somebody else. Show them that, well, where there's a will, there's a way. And I can't tell you how important it is to repeat that to yourself. If you don't say it out loud, say it in your mind about things you really want to have happen. Dream it, and then go to work. Where there is a will, there is a way. I hope I've made a believer out of you with this little story about old Whitey and my dad's will to make that horse his own and to benefit from him, even though he was a wild stallion. And it was an inspiration to me when I heard the stories, because it equated so much, so well with the rest of his life and my mom's life. And I hope that I picked up some of those characteristics and so on. If I did, and I think I did, because I can relate, I won't relate right now instances, but there's a lot of ways where I applied that and put it to the test, and it worked for me. And I pass it on knowing that it will work for you. Just keep saying it. Where there's a will, there's a way. Where there is a will, there is a way. Good luck with the will and good luck with the way. Apply both and you'll realize both. Love you. Bye.